You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest is Nick Stumbo. He's a former pastor and executive director of Pure Desire Ministries. And we're going to talk about the subject of porn addiction, which I think is going to be a much bigger topic than probably most people realize. So welcome, Nick. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, so glad to be here. And thanks for an opportunity to talk about a very important topic, but one that can be challenging for a lot of people to know how to, address in healthy and mature ways.
Yeah, you sent me a study, so I read over the stats of it. I don't remember all the stats, but I do remember they were very surprising and shocking. Maybe we could start with that as just a quick overview of some of the craziest stats that you learned from the recent study you showed me before we jump in.
Yeah, the study was done in conjunction with Barna, who, is well known for their research. And back in 2016, they did a survey called The Porn Phenomenon. And it was really the first time, I think, at large that a group had studied pornography use in our culture and with a specific focus on Christians and the church. And some of that data at the time was very revealing to people. And so we felt like after 8 years, as we've all lived through the pandemic and changes in our society and a whole generation of Gen Z teens becoming young adults, really the first generation of people who were raised with the smartphone and the internet their whole lives as childhood, what impact was that having? And so we felt the need for a follow-up study. And so Barna conducted that survey, 2,900 U.S. adults. It's really a qualitative survey, not quantitative. They find that you keep asking the same questions after a certain point, you just get more of what you've already found. So I think some of the big numbers, the survey found that 61% of Americans would say they are viewing pornography at some level, which may not seem all that surprising until we realize that includes like 44% of women. What's been traditionally thought of as, well, this is something men do, and all guys kind of have this issue. We found that women are increasingly consuming pornography and that the rate of growth among women using pornography is actually growing faster than men who view pornography.
What's the reason that men use it versus the reason women use it? Just to, before we continue in stats.
Yeah, well, that came out in the data a little bit, that one of the things that is in common for men and women is they're using it for pleasure, for something to turn to create that, that high, that feeling, all the hit of our neurochemicals and dopamine and the pleasure centers in the brain that light up. They have found that whether you're male or female, that is enticing. And I think there are some differences by and large where males tend to be more visually driven and kind of the classic spectrum of pornography use being visual, and whereas women may do it more out of a place of romance and fantasy and some of that. But what I would add in the work that we do, I try to remind people that pornography is not a benign, inert object out there that we just choose to consume, that pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's being driven by people who want to make money. And I think those people they've always been smart, but they're realizing, we've kind of tapped out in some ways the male market, or we're really doing well in the male market. Maybe we're missing a whole demographic here. And I'm hearing a lot about how pornography is being produced with women in mind, what appeals to women, the kind of storylines, the kind of even just the trigger points where a woman is more likely to be drawn into something versus a man. And so I think that's another side of it is, if someone is intentionally marketing someone to appeal to you, they're probably going to find a way to do it. And if you've got billions and billions of dollars on the line, they get pretty smart about it. So I think that acceleration of use by women is somewhat in part with just what we're seeing happening in that world as it comes to business and dollars and customers.
Well, it seems like the stuff I've seen is becoming more and more violent, to where it's like, just I would doubt women would like that. Where and how and what does it look like for them that's different than for men, in terms of what's shown?
Yeah, thankfully, I don't know too many specifics or details. I've not, I would say, delved into that too deeply. But here's something, I would note, just your comment of there is a lot of pornography out there now. It is more violent than ever. In fact, we've in culture, that's something that's now called the porn paradox, that never has pornography been more violent and abusive, and never has it been more popular. And it's like, why do those two things go together? Because I think if you ask the average person, are you drawn to this, and you describe something very violent in nature, we would have a similar reaction as you just did, like, oh, like what is going on here? And yet the reality is, much like other addictive substances, there is a level of tolerance that grows in people, that when you've been watching a certain kind of pornography over time, tolerance grows and the brain doesn't receive that same level of stimulus that it used to. And so it needs something more progressive or edgy or different. And over time, there's a very consistent process there where people go from what we might describe as quote unquote normal forms of pornography to increasingly violent or even illegal. And there may be a part of their brain that knows, I'm disgusted by this, while another part of their brain and their body is very turned on by it. And that, in the kind of work we do, can be incredibly shameful for people to feel like, I am now turned on by something that even just a short while ago, I would have described myself as offensive and disgusting. But that is the nature of addictive behaviors in our brain. It never leaves us where we are. It will take us further and deeper than we ever thought we'd go, and into places we didn't imagine would ever appeal to us. But that's why it's so important that we look at the addictive nature of pornography and what it's doing to our brain, because that is a reality for a lot of men and women.
When you said 61% of people use it, what does that mean? Is it once a day, 10 times a day, in terms of number of hours spent? What does it look like?
Yeah, it's all across the spectrum. The question, people could respond daily. They could say weekly, monthly, or less often, or never. And so I'm actually just flipping to the page where it's at to give you even more details if you'd like. The percentage of people that would say never, that they never view porn, is 34%. And in the daily and weekly category, 8% say daily and 18% weekly. So the 61% would be all categories combined.
Is there there's like a once a month, no big deal, and people seem to still function well? Or like, when does it really become a problem? What frequency, what level of...
One of the things we talk about is that when you look at pornography being a problem in a relationship, it's not so much about frequency as it is about the way that it's creating disturbance in your life and in relationships, or dependence. And that's one of the things we talk about, is how pornography is not in and of itself perhaps the issue that we're trying to solve. I mean, pornography is an issue, and I think the way it objectifies women and the violence portrayed, as I already mentioned, is a problem. But when you look at why people use it, one of the things we've really seen is it's usually something we're reaching out to as a way to medicate pain, to deal with problems in life. Just like other addictive behaviors, we go to it because it's our pseudo solution to make us feel better, to give us a pick-me-up, to numb out on life when things aren't going well. And so if that's the pattern that someone is stuck in, particularly when it is violating their morals, or, in the work we do, particularly with churches and Christians that would say, I really don't want to be doing this at all. It's something that I object to, I think is morally wrong. I wish I wasn't doing it ever. And so if that's how someone feels, where they're saying my preference would be I never use it. Well, even if they're turning to that once a month, that for them is too much, because they feel like I'm doing something that violates my own conscience. Where for others, if they're not necessarily trying to avoid pornography over conscience or morals, or because they're in a relationship where a spouse has said, hey, I don't want you doing this because it's offensive to me. If someone is not in one of those situations, to ask the question, when is it too much? I think it is to look at things like, where is this interfering with the kind of life I want to live? Keeping me from healthy relationships, keeping me from experiencing joy in other areas of life, or having an emotional awareness of... One of the things that pornography use and addiction can do is it really causes us to become numb to our emotions and to real human relationships, because we become so inundated by the world of fantasy and that reality that I can get anything I want anywhere at any time and use it for my sexual pleasure. Well, as you can imagine, that works against healthy human relationships, because that's not how other human beings function. They're not just there to meet our needs. And so if that's the way we're training our brain to think, then it becomes to pull away from healthy relationships. And so I think in that regard, it's, again, not about how frequent, but it's, if I'm seeing that happen in my life, then any level of use actually becomes a way of contributing to those unhealthy behaviors. one of the other things that we're hearing about a lot, this was not asked in the study, because in many surveys, there is a level of how personal people will get before they stop answering questions. But we do hear quite often in people's experience that and this is being confirmed by other research being done by medical groups, that erectile dysfunction among young adult men is skyrocketing. I read reports of doctors who have said, I never used to treat any men under the age of 40. And now that's all of my clients. It's all these young men that have grown up with porn at their fingertips. And then they meet a real person that they want to have a relationship with, and they're not able to be turned on in an intimate setting because they've so trained their brain for something different. So
that's terrible.
That to me is the danger of this. Sometimes we don't realize what a problem it is until we, maybe we've been a single adult or we're a teenager and we just think, this is normal and it's everywhere in culture. Doesn't everybody do this? And then we go to have a real relationship and we realize how much we've objectified other people, or the things that we have come to define as normal in a sexual relationship that pornography says are normal, but in a human relationship, another human being says, no, that is not okay. I'm not okay with violence or you choking me. And suddenly they realize something I've been using is a problem. And often by then it can be incredibly destructive. So I think that's part of my encouragement. It's to look at this use and say, is there any level at which this is truly healthy for me? Because I think the data in this survey would actually suggest the opposite, that there are not quote unquote healthy levels of porn consumption.
So is the only way in your experience to is it just to not engage in it at all? There's no safe level to engage?
By and large, I'd say if someone wants to have a healthy sexual relationship with another person, not engaging in pornography is the best route. Because something we see commonly in our society is the idea, and some counselors will even suggest it, that this is a way to spice up your sex life, right? Like you could make, even in your marriage, this is a way to have healthy sexuality. But the truth is we've seen that creates short-term wins, but long-term problems. That maybe in the short term, some of that use might create new ideas or, wow, we were really, into each other that evening. But one of the things that we know in studying the brain and the work we do is that the brain cannot distinguish between artificial and what's real. And so if you're in a real relationship engaging in pornography use, you are creating confusion in the brain that is trying to define the real by what it's seeing in images. And, as we know, between airbrush supermodels or things that are being depicted in a film, that is not a real relationship. So again, it's working against a healthy relationship and is something that has to be considered. Again, in my world, the realm I'm really working in, it's primarily with Christians that would say, I don't want this in my life at all because I morally object to it. If that's not where someone is at, is there a level in which it's safe? I don't know. I think they would have to answer that question, because it's a bit like saying, what is a safe level of poison for me to consume? Are there levels where you could consume it and it wouldn't affect you? I'm sure there is, just like, some of the things that are in our water or the foods we eat, there are dangers in there, but they're at such a low level, it doesn't really affect us. But at the same time, it's the question of, if I can avoid consuming poison, why wouldn't I pursue that and look to have the best relationships that I could have in my life?
So how do you work with people that use porn? Do you counsel them? Like how do people come to you? How do you find out about what's going on with them?
Yeah, so at Pure Desire Ministries, the way we were founded was actually by a pastor who was seeing this problem in his church. And, men were coming in to him for advice and counsel about their marriage and their finances and different topics. And he just had a way, I think, of reading men, and he would start to go deeper and find that under the surface, all of them were battling pornography, strip clubs, affairs, these unwanted sexual behaviors. And his training for ministry really hadn't taught him to deal with that at all. And so he went back to school, so to speak, and studied under a man who really is kind of I'd say the pioneer of sexual addiction in our society, and that's Patrick Carnes. Patrick Carnes, who developed the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, has some books like Facing the Shadows and Out of the Shadows, really dealing with sexual addiction. And so Dr. Ted Roberts studied with Patrick Carnes and took that material and said, I think the things you're working with here in addiction could really be built on top of a biblical foundation. Could I take this and use it in my church? And Patrick Carnes gave him permission to do that. And Dr. Ted Roberts then took a lot of that material that ITAP uses and worked it into small group curriculum for Christian men and then ultimately for Christian women as well. And that was 25 years ago that he began doing that in his local church. But because of that model of our foundation, that really is what we still prioritize and specialize in today, is helping get men and women in a small group environment with others who are pursuing the same kind of integrity and freedom, and helping them understand their whole story, to understand why they do this thing that they don't want to do. Not just, one of the ways I describe it is being different than a 12-step group, because maybe a lot of listeners would be familiar with 12 steps. And 12 steps are great because that is a place to go to be real, to be honest, and get support. But one of the differences for us is we're not simply coming and self-reporting how I did this week, and maintaining my sobriety, but I'm really looking at, why do I do this? What are the underlying factors, maybe from my past, from ways that I've learned to deal with pain and trauma in my life, how I've connected my sexuality to a way of escape or numbing out on life. And as I walk through this process with other people and hear how they're processing their life and the change they're making, it really encourages me as well. And so for us, it's really about connecting people to a group. We have about 150 groups that meet online through our website, but then also about 1,200 churches and communities or counseling centers that also run Pure Desire groups using our curriculum. So when someone comes to us, they're usually finding our website, or maybe they've heard our podcast and they're saying, man, I need help with this. And the first step is, let's help find you a group where you can walk through an experience that's meant to create transformation and change, and then also give you support from other people that are walking that same road, and they become that accountability partner. They become that man or woman that you can call and say, hey, I'm really tempted to go do the thing that I've committed not to doing anymore. Can you help me? Can you, hold me accountable that I'm not going to do that? I'm going to go do something else instead. And that really becomes, I think, a part of the process. And then the other piece of it is we have a team of counselors that, for about 30% of people that come to our groups, we find that they really benefit from having a professional who is walking through this journey with them. So counseling and groups are really the two primary ways that we help people. And as I mentioned, we have a podcast and blogs and all sorts of free tools on our website that really give people a place they can start exploring their own journey before they have to commit to going to a group and getting honest with other people. So a lot of resources at our website that can help people who are just trying to say, man, is this a problem in my life, and what could I do about it?
Well, are they the men that come to you, or the pastor you mentioned, are they saying it's a problem, or how do they describe the issue?
I would say by the time someone is motivated enough to change, it's either because it's causing real problems in their marriage, and they have a spouse who's saying, if you're going to keep doing this, I'm not going to stay around, and you either change or our marriage isn't going to make it. And so they're motivated. Or it is by and large men and women, because we have groups for women as well. We know that women, like I said from the survey, the numbers of women that are struggling is growing. And so we have groups for them as well. They are there because they're saying that they would like to be free of this and they'd like to see change. And so the material is meant to create that structure for them to move towards a life where they don't have to use pornography at all. And we see a tremendously high level of success for people that have committed to that group process.
Well, again, what do the men say about it versus what do the women say? How does it seem to affect them differently?
Well, having not been in a women's group, I won't try to say too much what women say. I know for men, a driving factor often is the shame and secrecy of feeling like there's behaviors in my life that I can't tell other people about because I feel some level of shame about what I'm doing. I wish I wasn't doing it. And yet, in spite of my efforts to stop on my own or to, use blocking software on my computer or not visit certain sites, not watch certain kinds of shows, they would say, I still find myself going back to it. And so that's the point, I think, where people get motivated to change. I've said to many people, because sometimes there's that thought out there, right, where someone say, I can stop anytime I want. And I'll say, well, that's awesome. And if you get to a place where you feel like, man, this is hurting my relationships, it's distorting the way I view women, I don't like what it does to my way of thinking, I want to stop, then try to stop. And if you find that you can't stop, that you keep going back, you will have learned something about yourself. And if that's the place where you're at, then come and talk to us, because we're here to help. And we want you to overcome a behavior that you've had to keep secretive and is creating shame in your life, that is creating just distress in relationships, so that you can live free of that and feel like in your relationships, especially with those you're closest to, you're able to be completely honest and not feel like you always have something to hide. So I think that's a lot of what motivates men. And I would guess in our women's groups, that's very similar. They've tried to stop because they've identified they don't want it in their life. But when they tried to stop, they found they actually felt more compelled to do it than they thought. It's again, using that language of addiction. What we talk about a lot is maybe we're not taking the drug, but in this case, the drug is with us in our brains because the level of dopamine released in the brain, the sexual high of a climax, is similar to the levels of dopamine released in the brain from someone using cocaine. So the addictive process really is about the dopamine and the neurochemicals in our brain. It's not just the substance we consume. So I think that's what people are saying many times without using that language. They're saying there is some process going on in my brain and my body that actually feels more powerful than my ability to stop doing it just because I decide I want to change. So that's a big part of what I think people are experiencing when they first begin a group process.
Is the remedy to advise them to just go cold turkey, or do they need to wean themselves off of it? Like, what works better?
I think the intent is I'm endeavoring to live without this. And so we create a structure where that is the plan. But then, as we acknowledge, for many people, there will be missteps along the way, or much like you might hear in addictive kind of groups, we call it a relapse. But try to say for us, a relapse isn't like, oh, now I'm back at square one, start the counter over, I'm back at 0 days. Instead, we're saying, let's look at a relapse and see what we can learn from it. Because if I was saying, I don't want this in my life anymore, and yet I chose it again, I can learn a lot from examining why did I choose that? What were the circumstances of my day where I justified going back there, or it sounded like a good idea? And what are the maybe lies that I even tell myself about this will be the last time, or I won't tell anyone, or it's no big deal. And then we find ourselves going back there and doing it again. Well, that can be a tremendous learning opportunity. So we try to have a balance there where, sobriety or freedom from that behavior is the goal. And for some people, when they engage in this process, they experience change quickly and don't have to have a period or a season where they're still going back to it. But for other people, it takes some time to really get traction. And we try to encourage them in a way to not see that as, beating ourselves up every time of, oh man, I'm so horrible. Why did I do this again? Or my spouse is so angry. I mean, that might be a reality. There may be a spouse who's angry, but instead saying that this may be a part of the learning process, because it really will reveal to you, why do you keep doing something if you are endeavoring not to do it at all? So we do see some of both, but we don't really have a plan to say, okay, let's have a plan where you're only going to look at porn this many times a month, because it really is one of those behaviors that when we give ourselves permission to open that door, we're actually enabling the whole system that keeps us trapped in that cycle, rather than looking at taking that honest assessment of why do I keep going back there? And when I'm really committed to not doing it at all, that's where I get clarity about when might I be violating my own principles to go back and do that again. So I hope that makes sense, that our goal is complete sobriety, but also working with people to say, hey, sometimes missteps are a part of the process and part of how we learn and grow.
Right. So what's involved in the program? Was it like if someone comes to you and asks for help, like any examples of stories, success stories, what they said?
Yeah, I think the most common story, and this is my story, I was a pastor in a church, and because of my moral convictions, I didn't want it in my life at all. It was hurtful to my wife. And even in engagement, I felt like I owed it to my wife to be honest that this was a struggle. And she, made it clear that she didn't like that idea and didn't want me doing that. And I agreed. I said, yeah, I don't want to either. And yet as we got married, I found I would, in spite of my best intentions, and I had accountability software on my computer, and I had promised her I wouldn't do it. Well, those boundaries were not enough to keep me from going back into pornography every few months. And it was sporadic enough that I could convince myself, I'm getting better, right? I felt like I was getting better. But the impact it was having on my wife, because she would ask from time to time, and I would be honest, like, yeah, I'm still struggling, but I'm working on it, right? It's getting better. And to her, she could see, I don't think this is getting better. I think you're just telling yourself it is. And so when I went to group for the first time, it was in 2010 that we first heard about Pure Desire Ministries, and I started a group. I joined a group. At that time, I had never really honestly faced my behaviors. I'd learned to kind of generalize. Yeah, I maybe look once in a while. But the group process for us really invites you to go a lot deeper into your story, to get a lot more honest about your behaviors. And on a weekly basis, you're not just showing up to say, did you look at porn or not? We use tools. One of those that I would describe briefly in group, so giving someone an idea of what to expect. We use a tool called the FASTER scale that actually was developed by someone who was working with drug addicts. And he believed, I can see someone's relapse several weeks in advance because they're walking down the same pathway. And he called that pathway FASTER. That when someone moves away from their priorities, their primary relationships, their faith center, they are forgetting priorities. That's the F. And if we keep forgetting our priorities, that produces anxiety. That's the A. And when we live in anxiety, in order to outrun that anxiety and feel like we're staying ahead of it, we start speeding up. So we're doing more, we're working harder. Well, our bodies aren't made to live in that speeding up state. And so we start to experience anger, and that's the T of ticked off. And when we're ticked off, we're starting to push people away, we're powering up, we're using our emotions to stay in control, but we can't live that way for very long. And so we get exhausted. That's the E. And when I'm in a place of exhaustion because I'm not following my priorities and I'm instead ticked off and I'm in exhaustion, then that opens me up to a place where I will relapse. And that's the R of faster. And so when we come to group, we're sharing where we are at on that faster scale, because hopefully we don't have to get all the way to a relapse or viewing pornography before we make a change. Maybe we see, oh, I'm yelling at my kids, or I'm going home and I'm kicking the dog. Where is that anger coming from? Well, that anger is probably some form of our process where we're not dealing with emotions or dealing with life very well. And if we don't deal with that anger, it's going to keep taking us down the scale to relapse. But instead, in my group, because I'm starting to see that pattern, I can get off the scale. I can deal with whatever's making me angry. I can come up with a plan for change. And by the way, that's another tool that at the end of every group meeting, you make a commitment to change, which is simply put, it is your plan for that week to walk in sobriety and not choose your old unhealthy behaviors. And having that pattern of seeing where I'm at long before I get to a relapse, and then making a plan and a commitment to my group to change before I get there, really becomes a big part of someone's healing journey. And I would say that's what was transformational for me. I was trying harder not to do it, but other than, maybe some blocking software on my computer, I didn't have any tools. I didn't have any support. I didn't have people that could say, hey, this is why you keep going back there. But when I did group, I started to see all those things, and implementing those tools along with that faith perspective, I think made a tremendous difference in my story. And that's what I hear. I tell a little bit of my story because that's what has happened over and over as I've now worked with hundreds of men in a group.
That's really good. How long does this process take? Is it like a month or multiple months or years? Or?
Yeah. So Patrick Carnes, who was the founder, of ITAP and really the pioneer of the sexual addiction treatment in our country back in the 80s and 90s, he's famous for saying that lasting change or permanent change is a 2 to 5 year process, which for some people is like, oh my goodness, why would it take that long? Well, a lot of the 2 to 5 years is for those who are married, it's about the marriage restoration and really getting to a new place in your marriage. We find that the behavior itself, that is, if someone is sincere about their change, is doing the work of group, showing up, staying consistent, that within the first 90 days, they're going to make significant change in their life. But, and you've probably heard this in other people's stories, it's much like drug addiction, that just because I've been able to wean myself off of the drug, it doesn't mean I've made the brain change to the point where I'm not going to go back to that if I just go about life as normal. And so that's why for us, our groups are usually 9 or 10 months long, because it gives the brain and our ways of thinking enough time to change and to solidify that change, so that if we do choose to be done with group, we're able to sustain that change and not just find that, every few months we have to come back again and walk through a group all over. So I tell people that after 2 or 3 months, you may be free of the behavior, but at that point, those systems in your brain that have gotten you trapped in this cycle are a bit like wet cement. They're still settling into place. And if you just go back to regular life, that wet cement will get remolded into whatever it used to do. Our brain has this homeostasis that it loves to return back to a setting that it's comfortable with. And if we're honest, many of us who have a history of using pornography, part of why we haven't changed is because it's our comfortable rhythm. It's kind of what we do as a part of dealing with life. And when we make change, if we don't really take the time to let that change solidify, we will probably kind of merge back into that comfortable way over time. So our groups, like I said, about 9 or 10 months long, but it doesn't take that long really to get the behavior under control when we're doing the work.
Do you have people that go through the program and then relapse and come back and do it multiple times?
Absolutely. Every story is different. Every journey is different. I'm thankful that I was able to find a group in my early 30s, but we have men and women that join group in their 70s and in their 80s. One of my coworkers is so great because he'll always say to a guy in his group, that's 75, he'll say, man, I'm so glad you're addressing this now because this is really hard to change when you're 85. There is some truth to that the longer we have operated a certain way in our brain, in our ways of thinking and behaving, the harder it is sometimes to change. And there are many reasons that we have men and women that will do group maybe several times, because the first time, what I have found often is if we're in, like, let's say someone comes to group and they're there because their wife has caught them in maybe some sort of an affair or a behavior that is blowing up their marriage. For many men, that first time through group is a little like triage. We're just trying to stop the bleeding. We're trying to create some health in their behavior, in their relationship. We're just trying to get them stabilized. And they will need another time through group to really do like the work of physical therapy, of really learning to walk in a different way, learning to have different relationships, learning to use their free time differently, learning to have healthier outlets when they're under stress or when they're angry or overtired. So going through group multiple times is not uncommon. And I would say it's not uncommon that if someone does group for a year or two, and then they're like, man, I'm doing so great, and they stop doing any kind of healthy behaviors, this is the kind of behavior that often comes back into our life. I've described it like having a stress fracture. If you have a stress fracture in your body from overuse, you can heal, you can feel great, but if you went back to your doctor's office and he showed you the x-ray, he or she would be able to show you where that stress fracture still is in your bone. And they would say, if you ignore healthy habits, if you go back to the things that caused this stress fracture, your bone is going to re-break along that exact same line because you think you can, ignore healthy habits. And that's what I've seen with people who come back after a period of health and find that they're relapsing or struggling again, is they've kind of drifted away from some of those healthy habits that they've developed, where they're not being honest with other people in their life. They're not dealing with stress, anxiety, or pain in productive ways. They're starting to hide behaviors or isolate from people that care about them. And the more we move into places like that, whether it's drugs and alcohol or pornography or other kinds of secretive behaviors that for that moment make us feel good, it can be something we go back into. So yeah, it's not uncommon, but there's often a good reason. It's not like we just get surprised by having a problem again. It's very often related to not paying attention to our health and veering back into those unhealthy patterns.
Well, there was a lady that I interviewed her. She did a book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and it gets even worse. She said that children are seeing this stuff and get addicted at unbelievably young ages, like 6 years old, younger. So it's so pernicious. It's affecting everyone from what I could see.
Yeah, so we've had that author on our podcast as well. And, she's really leading, I think, a crusade in our culture to say we've got to protect our kids, because that is so many people's story. I mean, I would say this. I mentioned already, I've led hundreds of men now in my own groups, and, Pure Desires had thousands and thousands of people do group. In every single story I've heard, someone was exposed to pornography before they knew what to do with it and before they were ready. It was always accidental or incidental. I was at a friend's house, an older cousin, a family member left out a magazine. And as kids, we do what kids do, right? We're curious. If someone tells us to look, we look. If there's something that we don't understand, we might have looked it up on the internet. And then suddenly we're exposed to something that our brain doesn't know how to handle. And so it's very kind of shocking and overwhelming. And yet at the same time, our brain is designed to be attracted to that. And so that becomes, for so many people, a huge part of their struggle, is that something happens to them in childhood where sexuality feels very exciting and dangerous, but also at the same time, they're curious and want to see more. And so they may have found these patterns develop in childhood and in their teenage years before they even really knew what they were saying yes to. And if we had an adult brain when we were 7 years old and someone said, hey, do this, we'd say, no, I don't want to do that. But when we were 7 years old, we didn't have that adult brain. We had the brain of a 7-year-old. And 7-year-olds are impressionable, and 7-year-olds do things that kids do. But that can often be what creates that pattern for a lifetime. And so that's another piece of the work we do in group, is helping people see, where did this start in your story? Or a phrase that we use, what makes this make sense? And when if you met a 45-year-old guy that's looking at some kind of violent porn or fetish-driven porn, yeah, you might be like, man, why would you do that? But I would bet if you heard his story of where he was first exposed to pornography, or things that happened to him in childhood that were sexual in nature, and then heard the rest of his story, you would say, oh, that actually makes complete sense. I can see why you ended up where you are because of what's happened to you along the way. And when we can kind of piece our whole story together, that's where change, I believe, really becomes possible.
Okay, it makes sense. So what's the best way for people to reach out if they feel like they have a problem? Can you help people everywhere or just local to you?
No, that's one of the great things is so many of our resources and tools are available online. They can visit our website at puredesire.org. So that's puredesire.org. We have free tools like blogs and podcasts and different worksheets that someone can go through just to kind of develop guardrails in their life or some healthy habits. But then we also have online groups for men and for women. And we have people from literally all over the world that have joined our online groups because they meet at different times of the day, different days of the week. So if you go on there, you can, on our website, it says, I'm looking for a group or I'm looking for help. And if you're male or female, you click on the right button, and it will show you what groups are available for you to join. So that help is available. And then we also have on there, I mentioned we have about 1,200 churches and community groups meeting around the country and around the world. So we do have a map of a groups finder on our website that you could look on a map and see, are there any groups meeting near me? Because for some people, doing a group in person is very powerful. That opportunity to actually sit in a room with people who can look me in the eye and say, yeah, you're not the only one, I've been there too, is very powerful. So I'd recommend people check out where there might be an opportunity to find a group around them and reach out to the group leader listed there on our website.
All right, well, very good. Well, Nick, thank you for what you're doing. It just seems like a horrific spreading pernicious problem that affects a lot of people. So I'm glad that you're doing this, and I appreciate you being here on this podcast.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. And I know not everybody's ready to change or maybe even thinks it's that big of a deal, but I think there are many who are saying, I think this is hurting me and hurting my relationships. I'd like help, and that's what we're here for. So hopefully today's podcast or episode helps people think about that, and we're here to help when they're ready.
Well, very good.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.